And good morning. Here we are. Sun's up. Sun's up bright. Days are getting longer. Life is good. Have you turned your sprinklers on yet?
Got to do that today.
I think it's
It's
just
not-
about any day here. We'll have to turn those on.
It's not Mother's Day.
That's what Sandra tells me, but the grass doesn't know that. It's pretty bleak looking.
Yeah.
Well, let's get started, fellas. We're, of course, in the Gospel of John, and let's move right into our text this morning. Really, we're going to move into this text and then hopefully have a kind of stop about 3/4 of the way through with a very interesting statement by Jesus. And I think it'd be good for us to kind of think about that. And so we'll just see, going to try to finish the whole thing, but we'll see how it goes. Last time we talked about that core teaching of Jesus that you guys are very familiar with. And of course, the context, he that wins his life will lose it. He that loses it will gain it. That teaching, a grain of wheat. And when Jesus teaches about following him, this is what he says. It had direct application to the audience, John to the first century church. And I think we all believe that it has application for us today. We then talked about the ramifications of all that and had a really good discussion, like we most often do. I'll go ahead and read this. And actually, would one of you read, if you can see the screen or your Bible, would one of you read John 12:27-33?
Now my soul has become troubled. And what am I to say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this purpose, I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came out of heaven. I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. So the crowd who stood by and heard it were saying that it had thundered. Others were saying, an angel has spoken to me. Jesus responded and said, this voice has not come for my sake, but for yours. Now judgment is upon this world. Now the ruler of this world will be cast out. And I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. Now he was saying this to indicate what kind of death he was going to die.
Okay, I think we're probably all familiar with this, but there's a lot of enigma in this section, which is often the case, which is why we're in week 167, by the way. So, but we're all having fun, and we keep showing up because we like our time together and talking about it. So let's take a look at this. First of all, it's kind of an overview of what happened. And Jeff, thanks for reading that. And he says, now my soul has become troubled. And what am I to say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this very purpose, I came to this hour. And we're familiar with that statement, but what we're not familiar with is where John uniquely places this. The other Gospels, I'm not sure if it's in all three. I don't know that. I didn't check it, but it is generally placed in the garden. This statement where Jesus sweat great drops of blood, really the agony of the whole event. John places it uniquely right here. This instance is placed, it occurs right after the triumphal entry, which we've looked at, and before the events. This is before the events of the last evening, that'll begin in chapter 13, just within a couple of weeks. Jesus verbalizes his troubled state, but he quickly transitions to purpose. He says it. It is here on the heels of the triumphal entry that Jesus talks about the coming cross event, his troubled soul and his purpose for coming. So let's drill into that. First, then, we observe that the coming cross event is acknowledged but John leaves out the details described by the other gospel writers. This is because John's intent is to communicate to his first century audience Jesus's purpose, and his purpose has everything to do with glorification of the Father. And we've referenced, I think it's in John 20 verse 30 and 31, I believe, what it states it right there. Note how Jesus, this is really interesting. Jesus steers his thoughts and his feelings through a redirecting them to what is actually true. And that, excuse me, that's his purpose. The only way, okay, here's my point here. The only way he can do that, respond like this while facing this horrific cross event that's coming, I am of the belief that he knew it was coming, is that he's got to believe that ultimately what we would call it's going to be okay, that there's another side. You know, Hebrews talks about for the glory that, or for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, he went through it. Well, it's the same idea right here. And this okayness has absolutely everything to do with his relationship with the Father. It is because of this relationship that it's going to be okay. And he's relying upon that as he's headed towards Jerusalem. Now, here we have from purpose to glorification, verses 28, 29. Father, glorify your name. Okay, then when he said that, right on the heels of his purpose statement, Father, glorify, he turns to the Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came out of heaven. And the voice, it states here, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. It's a bit full of enigma there, and we're going to talk about that. So the crowd who stood by and heard it were saying, well, it thundered. And others were saying, an angel has spoken to him. So the crowd knew something happened, but they didn't know what happened. When something is glorified, okay, I'm going to go into my attempt at a definition. When something is glorified, it means that it is revealed for all to see. Think about a statue in an art museum, for instance, and you can picture the director of the art gallery. The art form has been hidden, and he goes over and pulls the curtain away, and everyone gasps at the beauty of what they see. That is, in a sense, an act of glorification. Through the person of Jesus, we know what God is like. The text states that Jesus is the exact representation. When we wonder what God is like, a great place to start is the person of Jesus. We can learn a lot about what God is like through looking at Jesus. And through his presence, he is glorifying God. He is revealing what God is actually like. All the way back and referring internally to verse 14 of chapter 1, the Word, and this is in the purposes of John, John wrote, the Word became flesh, like you and I. He dwelt among us. We saw his glory. We saw his revealing action, glory as of the only Son from the Father, revealing the Father, full of grace and truth. That is what characterizes the glory. That's what characterizes Jesus's actions, is grace and truth. That is a mouthful and would be really great for us to think about. Grace and truth. All anxieties, fears, dreads, and doubts are focused on his living, moment by moment relationship with the Father, as stated in John 1:14. Everything. Absolutely everything we have seen Jesus doing and saying has been originated from this relationship. Likewise, all that is about to occur will flow from this relationship as he is moving towards the cross event. It is the relationship which is unchangeable. Here, Jesus is demonstrating for all to see the depth of what this means, that Jesus is actually exemplifying what this can look like for all of us. Not for that purpose. I think it's got a much larger purpose, but it definitely demonstrates what this relationship looks like and the power of it within. He does so in order to provide hope for all people. Hope for all people. And then here's the verse again. We've already read it. The crowd, again, we're still on purpose and purpose to glorification. The crowd perceived this moment that something occurred. But in contrast to the definitive statement of Jesus, the crowd is responding with confusion. In contrast, John makes it quite clear the meaning of the moment as Jesus is stating, but the crowd, they didn't get it. They didn't perceive it. The crowd understood what occurred through their own created filter devices. That's what we want to look at it from that perspective. They put it in their heads. They equated what occurred to thunder. That's what they created. Or others, maybe with a more astute theological mindset, maybe they thought, well, no, we interpret that as an angel spoke to him. But none of them got it, what was actually occurring. They knew something was occurring, but they didn't know what it was. These folks are no different than you and I because they're human. They're not bad people. They're human people. Human people. That's an interesting term. Yes, of course, we're all human. And so we have before us a snapshot of this dilemma. God is acting for the direct good, but the crowd's unable to receive it. The reason is because they're self-created constructs of thinking. One more statement, or maybe two. And it is this that Jesus is about to save them from. This is really big. We've looked at it numerous times, but this is a demonstration of the dilemma. So Jesus responds, and he says to this confused crowd, this voice has not come for my sake, but for yours. There he is, grace and truth. Now judgment is upon this world. Now the ruler of this world will be cast out. That is a loaded phrase. And if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. And then John interprets, he was saying this to indicate what kind of death he was going to die. Let's take a look at that. Our time is good. I'm kind of moving quickly so we can save some time to talk about some of this. Jesus, being aware of the crowd's confusion, he responds, and they're confused about this voice from heaven. First of all, he responds by words of hope. His words are expressed through three facts designed to provide the meaning of the moment. So that's what we want to look at. And let's take a look at these three facts. Fact one, Jesus says, this voice is not for me, but it's for you. It's actually for you. This is, I think, pretty interesting. Jesus assures the confused crowd that what has occurred, which they have yet to understand, is for them. Okay, that is really something. He says, this isn't for me, this is for you. What they hear, like thunder, and or a voice from an angel's voice. This in itself is a critically directive statement. That's how I word it, wordy, designed to point out that what is occurring is not to validate anything in regard to Jesus, but rather to bring hope to the listener. Okay, this is a really slight nuance here. The crowd is looking for evidences. They want evidences. That's what we humans, they're looking for evidences so they can give themselves permission to believe. Is he the one or is he not the one? They want evidences. But what is actually, God doesn't really care about that. What is actually occurring is that God is acting on their behalf right before their eyes, and they are unaware. God is acting right here, and they are missing it. And they're not bad people, they're human people. They are unaware, as just stated, because their intent is elsewhere. They're looking for something else to satisfy their own needs. Again, attempting to slot what is occurring within the framework of their own belief system. This is what we're talking about. Here we see God speaking and no one hearing. I mean, they hear something, but they don't understand the significance of what is being said. The reason is because they're looking for God to speak the way they think he ought to speak. And that, of course, I've done that many, many times. Now, judgment, fact two, now judgment is upon this world. This 31 is a mouthful. Judgment is upon this world. Now the ruler of this world will be cast out. When the gavel strikes, think of the judicial courtroom. When the gavel strikes the sounding block, it means the judgment has now occurred. It's now happening at this moment, which it'll now, from this moment on, it's put into effect. Boom. And that judgment from that definitive moment of the gavel striking means that life has changed from that point on. Something new is occurring. That is the idea of this judgment. Judgment always follows an ordeal. The ordeal is the struggle, the conflict, the dilemma. Judgment is the resolve. Judgment is the answer to the ordeal which has occurred. Thus, the judicial court system. This means that what is about to occur through the cross event will have world application, because when the judgment is now speaking, the word world is used twice in verse 31. This is a world application of what we're talking about. I've got a note here. I believe that the cross event is in the crosshairs. That's what he's referring to. As Jesus states, this world application, verse 31, is the complete nullification of the ruling power and presence. That's how I interpret 31. Note, here's my note. My opinion, fellas, is that that what is in the crosshairs, I said, is the cross event. Jesus is talking about the cross event, and through the cross event, which would mean the arrest, the death, the burial, the resurrection, the ascension, that whole event is in view here. And that through that event, the nullification of the power, this power, world power, will be completely nullified through that event. That's how I look at verse 31. This language is unique to John and in direct relationship to his stated purpose, as in chapter 20. And we could look at, we're not going to look at it, but in 1430 and 1611, John uses this unique language of the ruler of this world. Now, all of us have categories that we're working from in relation to what this means. And John is calling it the ruler of this world. That's unique to John. Through the coming cross event, a world application will be put into effect, the judgment. And that application is the resolve for the human condition. And the resolve has everything to do with a casting out of the current controlling power at the event. That's what I think, verse 31, that's what I think Jesus is saying in verse 31. Whatever he's going to do, the ruler of this world will be cast out. Now we're going to go into this discussion now. And here's the verse, and I go, whoa, wow, time out here, guys. Whoa, this is, to get our attention. Jesus has just stated a mouthful, if we think about it. Now we're going to drill down into this and think about what he just said and the ramifications of what he just said in relation to our world. And it's a mouthful, and the mouthful, like always, is intended to be good news. Jesus is about good news, bringing hope to the audience. Okay, let's talk about this. I've got 3 questions. This, first of all, and I don't have any agenda for us, but I think it's really good that we think about this. How would the crowd have understood what Jesus just told them? What do you guys think? Given what we've talked about, how would the crowd understood what Jesus said? And we'll just take a stab at it. We don't know, but we can kind of guess. How would they have understood what Jesus just said? The ruler of this world will be cast out. What did they understand?
Well, Mike, I think that this, for much of the crowd, would have brought even more confusion, because we have the luxury of looking at the cross event in hindsight. And we knew, and John told us he's talking about the type of death he would die. But I think for the majority of the crowd, they didn't even know what was coming in regard to the death of Jesus. If there was a portion of the crowd that believed he was the Messiah, they could very well have continued to think this guy is a conquering king. He's coming in to throw out Rome. And that's the ruler of this world, was Rome in their eyes.
Yeah, I think you hit it.
It could have been even more confusing to them until after the cross event, and they look back and they say, oh, this is what he was talking about. But at this point, I think it would have caused even more confusion to a lot of the crowd.
Well, you have hit the nail on the head from my perspective. They're thinking of Roman rule, Gentile rule. When Jesus died on the cross, it didn't change that. And so the first century church is then asking the question, if he is the Messiah, then how do we understand this?
Yeah.
But their head, when they when they hear the term, the ruler of this world, what do they think? They think of Rome.
Yeah,
That is what they're thinking of. I think you're exactly correct. If we look at it from that perspective, why did John put it in there? Because he's trying to make some sense of this confusion. How do we understand Jesus, thus his statement? So, Jeff, thank you. I think that's good enough for one. They would have understood it that way, and I think we're on safe ground. Now let's go to John. There's another layer. How did the first century church, John is writing this late in the 90s, late first century, and how would they, how do I have the question? How did the first century church understand what John included here? How did they think about it? Bill?
Wow, I mean, my mind's going all over the place here, but to focus on your questions, if you look up there and you say, now judgment is on the world, and change one word there and say, now the power of this world will be cast out. There's several times when Jesus was working with his disciples saying, let's call down fire on them. They say, you don't know the nature of your Father. And they're saying, we want to be seated beside you. And he says, no, this is not how it works. Everything's upside down. So at the time they thought Rome, but he's going to be crucified maybe by the Romans, but really by the leaders of Israel. He's going to be crucified by the power structures, and they're going to be like Herod and Caesar got along. And so I think the first century church looked at this and said, whoa, we misunderstood this. We thought it was Israel versus Rome. No, this is anybody who seeks power or control or dominance. That's the nature of the person of this world. And we're not going to be that way. Of course, they didn't for a while, at least, and I don't know how long it lasted, but they existed in a structure that didn't really have a power structure, because power structures are destructive. And that's my 2 bits.
That also is very insightful. And they again, if we look at the cross event, that at the macro view, nothing really changed. As the expectation, they were looking for someone to come in and wipe out, probably in a military type of scenario. That's how we would cast it, in a forceful, and then set up this new kingdom in the temple, and it would be hunky dory. That did not happen. And there was a huge amount of confusion. And Jeff, you mentioned Rome. Bill, you extrapolated that out now to the end of the first century, that maybe it's broader of power, just this power to overcome. And that, I think that's what you're talking about, right?
Right. I think there's a natural power corrupts, and power corrupts absolutely,
Yeah.
and he's the antidote to that.
Yep. Where he says there's judgment occurring, the ruler of this world, which can have different definitions here. I think you're stating it is more of a generalistic power, the ruler of this world, which is how this world operates. Now we're looking at it how they would have looked at it. And I think that's what you're pointing us to, isn't it, Bill?
Well, what did Adam and Eve get? What were they looking for? Power. And that plagued mankind ever since then. And when Satan came to Jesus in the desert, and his temptations were, make a show of things, give people what they want, bread, or if nothing else, worship me and I'll give you the kingdoms. All of that portrays around the fact of exercising power over others. And Jesus said no.
Yeah. It's certainly, it's certainly about doing what I want to do, which is, if we look at it in the primary sense of in the garden, well, no, they were responding to the voice, to the snake, that if the day you do this, you'll be like God. So there was a promise. There was something that would, in their mind, they would believe that would embetter them,
Right.
make them more powerful, as you
It-
would say. Yes.
Yeah, I just one more thing on top of this, he, in Deuteronomy, when all the laws are given, there's an area where they talk about being generous, being open-handed to the foreigner, et cetera, and they say, there should be no poor among you. And they talks about how to be generous to the poor. And then he says, but there will be poor among you. And
Yeah.
then you get to Jesus's manifesto in Luke, where he says, I've come to preach good news to the poor. Well, how did that play out? It didn't seem to look that way during his life, but as soon as the first century church was set up, we have a society, forgive the word, that looks socially communistic, if you will. And interestingly, and there was they shared the property, they did that, they said, and there were no poor among them. It's kind of like when he said, "Bring good news to the poor," that was a red flag to everybody, saying, don't you dare take mine away from me, crucify him. That's all about power.
Yeah, that's about power. Whereas the demonstration in Acts 2 or Acts 4,
Yeah,
where there's now this sharing through these followers of Jesus are now sharing, which is that's a head turn.
mind-boggling.
So, okay, we've talked about okay, Tatsi, go ahead. There you are. Tatsi, you moved around on the screen. You left it, and now you're up there on the left. I had to look for you.
I think specifically, to me at least, he's talking about Satan as the ruler of this world.
Well, that's what we've been taught.
Yeah.
That is certainly an impression. That's
Well, when-
true. And of course,
when
we're
did
asking,
that
is that? Yeah.
When did that concept come in? Okay, in other words, did it come in during the first century, or is it something that evolved through the doctrine of the churches as they were founded?
Right. Well, let's go to the third question on that, and we'll get into that, because Tatsi, exactly, and you're the scientist, you're leading us to where we're going to go here.
Okay.
How do we think about what Jesus just said about the ruler of this world? Tatsi has expressed a very, very common belief, and I'm not baiting anyone here by any means. But what is interesting, if it is Satan, then how do we talk about Satan today? What kind of latitude are we giving this evil presence today? And how does that relate to what Jesus is saying right here? I mean, there's some tilt here. Jesus just said about the ruler of this world, specifically, what we're looking at the words of Jesus. And of course, then you got to compare that to what is said about Satan. If we take Tatsi's line of thinking in the rest of the New Testament, I mean, there's a lot here, and it's really good for us to put a hand up and think about it. John, did you raise your hand?
Yeah, I did a little bit. So, isn't scripture it's absolutely incredible how it speaks. And so to start on one level, this war that is going on with ourselves and the power structure. I loved how Bill brings in just the concept of power and how our power corrupts. So you can read all of scripture through that power thing. But I'm kind of with Tatsi here. I think John is putting a spotlight on the bigger picture, right? So it's just, what should I say, different ways to keep looking and understanding this. And the idea that, I mean, Paul would say, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against, something bigger, right? Back to the garden, with the snake. This whole thing in the next verse says, he says, and if I be lifted up from earth, I'll draw draw all men to myself, which he said in John 3 to Nicodemus. He had that conversation with Nicodemus, which was, you think your belief system is this. I want to, there's another dimension that I want you to become aware of. And everybody's kind of going, what? Be born again? What are you talking about? And then he says in John 3, if I be lifted up, this whole idea of the cross, and Paul would say, I preach Christ and him crucified. So this cross event, right? And this idea of the ruler, Bill was talking again about the temptations of Jesus, right? And that temptation in the wilderness was with the devil. So is there a devil, which seems to come through, Ezekiel, there's a bunch of places in the Old Testament. And is there a spiritual dimension to this thing we call life? And is the devil, when he was cast to earth, is he really the ruler of this world, which John is reminding everybody of? So I'm kind of with Tatsi. There's this big picture. And the reason for the cross was to, deal with that power that, and to cancel it. So there are all these different ways of my point. I think we live on this one level, but to not acknowledge him, why did Jesus spend a quarter of his ministry dealing with demonic spirits, unclean spirits?
I think just a minute, Jeff, where we are at this time in our conversation is that we've all adopted the idea that Jesus is talking about a something bigger, something, and you use that term, I use my hands. The question, and we're not going to resolve it today, but it's really good to think about, how do I understand that? And if whatever happened to that larger power was nullified at the cross, as Jesus is saying here, how do I understand that statement in how the New Testament writers talk about it, and how we throw around this idea today in the church? This idea of this individual personality walking around and picking on people like bullies and say, you better watch out because Satan is looking over and he's going to tempt you and this kind of thing. Well, how do we understand that? It might be a good idea to really dive down into what we're talking about. Tatsi has raised a great question. You said, where did this idea come from? And that might be that would be a really good exercise for us people to look at that, where, how this idea of the devil as depicted in, the modern terminology, how that derived is a really good study. So the question on the table is, Jeff, I'm not going to miss you, Bill, but Jeff's got.
Yeah, Jeff first.
And I'm just wrapping up. And
Yeah.
boy, this is exactly how we're not here to arrive at a conclusion at this moment, but I think we're here to hopefully stimulate some thought about this idea. How then do I understand this evil presence? We're not denying evil. Evil exists. How do we understand it? And that's what we're talking about in this third thing. So, Jeff, you had a comment, and then Bill.
Yeah, what I was going to say is I'm in the camp that believes that there is an actual evil. Satan is an angel of God that fell, that has been battling against God since that time. What I was trying to understand here, and what I think is Jesus was saying, is that the ruler of this world will be cast out. To me, that is saying that because of what I am going to do on the cross, the power that Satan has over this world is going to be nullified. If you take on a life with me, if you remain outside of that, then the power that Satan has will continue to have influence on your life until, and this is way beyond what we're talking about, but until the time that I cast him into the eternal fire, the lake of fire, or whatever you want to call it, he's still going to have power in this world. Your only hope of overcoming that power, of not being of the consequences of that are to be with me, and that because of what I'm going to do on the cross. That is what's going to cast out Satan's power, not necessarily that Satan is gone from this world, because I believe, and you guys can shoot all kinds of holes in this if you want, I believe that Satan is still in power in this world. Look at what is going on in this world and tell me there's not an evil influence on what goes on in this world. But that's a different topic. But I believe that the casting out at this point was that Jesus says his power is gone if you are with me.
Okay, Jeff, thank you for, again, you're always concise and so helpful. And thanks for making your statement. And that is certainly one view,
I might just have thrown so much more confusion in there, but that's,
but
we can.
Jeff must have a television in his house somewhere. You've been watching TV, the news.
Yeah.
Notice where we've come from, where the slide started. What were these people thinking about?
Mike, one thing that came to my mind was the diversion of focus from like what Jeff, I guess, originally said, that the people probably were thinking in terms of Rome. They rule everything.
That's pretty safe.
That's a pretty reasonable conclusion, but it's a singular enemy. It's Rome. If we get rid of Rome, then everything will be fine. And then what Tatsi brought up, it's like, well, it's Satan. But, in modern culture, at least in my mind's modern culture, Satan, we have these cartoons. It's, a Flip Wilson kind of, the devil made me do it. It's a singular presence walking around doing stuff. But Ephesians talks about principalities and powers and might and dominion. To me, that's a more masked, harder to identify system that is destroying people without them realizing what's going on. There is no enemy that they can identify and say that's the problem. Right. It's a system.
Yeah.
And Mike, you're having guys coming into Christ in the Rockies that are, we'll call it victims, because I can't think of another word, of addiction, and they have no way to get out of the hole they're in. It's like, how the heck did they become addicted? Well, this whole system is leading them to a place that they can't crawl out of. Everything is against them. The economy's against them, politics against them, housing costs are against them. Your
family structure,
family dynamic. There's no father in the home.
Oh my,
Is this coming from Vince?
It breaks my heart. It really.
It's an unidentifiable enemy. It's not like you can, get memories in your brain and resist the devil and he will flee. That's it. The devil's the problem. The devil the problem. In the meantime, your property taxes are going up. There's a fight in the country you've never heard of. The TV is blasting problems. Some guy in Malaysia got into a traffic accident, and it's like, oh my God, I'm getting overwhelmed. This is incredible.
Yeah.
And next thing, and you're getting buried. I think what Tatsi was saying is these guys in the crowd heard a voice, and those that recognized what was being said, some didn't understand the words, if they thought it was thunder. It's almost like the Life of Brian joke, from Monty Python. It's like, blessed are the cheesemakers. What did he say? And it's, but I think it occurred to them all of a sudden, it's like, Rome's not our problem. It's the religious guys that are our problem. Rome wouldn't have given a damn if Jesus was walking around. They didn't care. But they had the ear of the rulers of this organization that more rules our life than Rome does.
Yeah.
Rome rules the dirt, but the culture is ruled by these guys that we're following. And they're the ones that want him dead. And it's like, I never thought, it never occurred to me that these guys are against me.
And the problem is too, is if you're going after the power structure, once you tear it down, you're going to be the new power structure. So it's got to be a mental shift.
Yeah.
What I wanted to say was real quick. There's a passage in 2 Corinthians that caught my attention once. I underlined it. And he's giving advice to them. And he says here, but I'm afraid that just as Eve was deceived by the serpent's cunning, your minds may somehow be led astray from your sincere and pure love. So he's saying the serpent Eve, this is all a mental game. And that if you go back to the temptations in the wilderness, you don't have Jesus talking to a separate entity. I mean, he would have never even been a good Jew. If he thought that was Satan, he would have just had nothing to do with him. I believe all these arguments he had with Satan were what he were fighting in his head is what he thought might be good ideas. Maybe I'll turn these stones to bread. Maybe I'll jump off the temple. Maybe I can just take the power structure and I can run the show. And I think all those things were from Satan, but he had to come to peace with, I better not do that. And so it's a lot more subtle than you think. And we struggle with that too. I have a good idea. Let's just, I'll get my political party in power and we can straighten this all out, And well, what are you going to do with that power?
What we have done, thank you, Bill. What we're doing is none of us here on this study are denying the presence of evil. And we've talked about it as this larger thing. Early in our conversation, Jeff identified Rome. Later in the conversation, right on your heels, Bill, you talked about this idea of power. We're starting to think about evil from a different perspective. Vince's comments, Bill's comments, and each of you are talking about asking the question, how do we understand this reality? And that is a really healthy thing to do. And why it's healthy is not so much us, but as elders in our faith communities, our Christian communities, how do we think about this and how can we help others in their journey as we think about this in a healthy sense? And so, Bob, the words of wisdom. I keep picking on you and I shouldn't be doing that, but
like I said, the sagacious Mr. Powell.
Mr. Powell.
Pressure.
If John, the author of the Gospel, John, is the same John that authored the last book in the Bible, I think we can look ahead and at least give us hope as to answering this question. And I've been thinking all morning about this passage in the 5th chapter of Revelation, where they break open the seals and the angels are crying out and they're singing, "Worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing." And I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea and all that is in them saying, "To him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and might forever and ever. And the four living creatures then said, Amen, or oh yes, Amen. And the elders fell down and worshiped. So my point is that, you know, we live in the moment, but the great hope that we're living through in this Easter season, extended Easter season, that we know who wins and who ends up with the power and who's on the throne.
Yeah. I think we're all pointing to Jesus, definitely. And this cross event is absolutely monumental.
Mm-hmm.
John.
Yeah, I only want to point down to Carl because he's a little shady there. He's been trying to say something. And
Oh, Carl.
I want to make sure we hear from Steve too before we.
Thank you, John. Thanks for observing that. And Carl, what do you have to say there?
Well, I was just thinking on this too. Satan goes about, you see this all the time, but we talked about a little bit. Satan goes about like a roaring lion seeking to destroy and devour. And we see that happening all the time. So Satan's presence is still moving on. He hasn't been taken out, but Jesus made the statement, if I be lifted up, then all these things possible. Well, it turned into not an if, but Jesus has been lifted up. So now that gives Christians the power to go out into the world and preach the gospel, share the gospel, and lives are changed, people's hearts are changed, lives are saved. So it's wonderful what Jesus did here, but you see the two powers, Satan destroying and Jesus saving and lifting people up.
Well, thank you, Carl. Thanks for those comments. And you've referenced this next fact, and we'll go there as we kind of start our approach, final approach here. And verse 32, you mentioned this, Carl. And if I, Jesus, again on the heels of what we just talked about, and in addition to, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. And then John adds an interpretive statement. Now he was saying this to indicate what kind of death he was going to die. It says, I think, okay, this is my opinion. I think it's safe to say that the audience would have made the correlation between what Jesus said in Numbers 21 about the serpent on the staff. I think this was so ingrained within their thinking that term lifted up would have clicked. And I think, I mean, that's my opinion. Also, it's a great example of how Jesus uses the Old Testament scriptures to communicate his message. And through what Jesus is about to accomplish on the cross event, he says here, he makes this definitive statement, all people will be drawn toward. This is a world application event, a world event here. All people will be drawn toward. This means that through what Jesus is about to do is intended for world scope. The outcome, which he labels as draw, is an invitation to act in the same manner as Jesus, thus will be glorified again. This is how I understand the words coming from heaven. I have glorified it through the presence of my Son, and I will glorify it again. Here again, what the voice from heaven is communicating is that through what Jesus is about to accomplish, God will be glorified, which means on display for all to see again and again and again and again and again through people who are followers of Jesus, just like you and me. this is the intent, for us to demonstrate what, and only through his presence within our lives, over and over and over again. So that is, that's it. We really accomplished what I had intended, is to get through and to focus some time on, I got a phone call coming in. And we're not going to talk about this, but we had a really good discussion. There is a lot of stuff, Tatsi, you're taking a picture of that screen, and I'll finish it out for you. We're not going to discuss it because we got to wrap up. And there's a lot in here. And again, there are different views. I understand that on this, this personification, or how do we understand this evil presence? We've all talked about and given different perceptions on that. That is a really important question. And the reason it's important is because, again, how do I understand it in order for me to be helpful to people around me? Basically, that's it. How can I be helpful? Yeah, Bill, you want to wrap it?
Yeah, you forgot a line on there. You just need to put down part 1, because we need to review this next time. Part 2.
We'll have plenty of time to review it. Yeah. All righty, we're going to take off. Oh, John, you got
Got
something.
2 minutes. Steve,
Okay.
Steve, we haven't heard from you. What are
Yes,
you
sir.
thinking?
I'm trying to figure out what I'm thinking here, but I think Mike really summarized it with his statement there a screen or so ago, an invitation to act in the same manner as Jesus. And that's something for all of us to ponder.
Yeah.
What does it mean?
Yeah.
Does it mean that we go to the ballot box and vote a certain way? Does it mean that we do things like what Christ in the Rockies is doing? Does it mean that we live with our spouses in a certain way, or our families? Yeah, power is important, as Bill has pointed out.
Great
Something
work,
for us
Steve.
to work on.
Yep.
So, Mike, I would only add, we got a minute.
Thank you, Steve.
You're watching the clock.
Well, because I know Mike's going to go whoosh. But
I want to cut it off at 8. So
we all want our world that we are comfortable in. And so part of the thing is everybody just looking at it a little differently, thinking the same, we're just looking at this differently. If you go to the doctor, you're sick. And if you go to the doctor, you want your health restored. Now the doctor says to you, here, take this pill. Say, so one thing, but then, that's one way. Now the other doctor you go to, he says, it's about being mindful. You need to be more mindful about what you eat and how you eat, right? So it's about diet. The other doc says you need exercise, right? The other doc says mental illness, right? And so we approach the problem so differently, right? With all these different angles that they all are kind of true. John's trying to pull us up to a different dimension and say, here's the bigger picture, like Bob and Revelation and Tatsi and the ruler of this world. But we probably had bad experiences growing up. So that's like, so we come back down a level or two and we talk about power structures. And the people probably did understand the power structures. So we live in this world of conflict. What I want to say is, let go of some of your, I only want to talk about the mind, or I only want to talk about power structures, or I only want to talk about political things, right? Somehow Jesus, through this, is pulling us into something, this faith journey that is bigger. And all these different pieces to the puzzle, I think, are true, right? They're true. It's just, let's hear what somebody else, these different angles, and that would give us the strength to go on this journey, give us the hope as far as where we're headed. So it's just always great to hear other people.
How do you
Yeah.
eat an elephant,
Guys, we're
One
gonna
bite at a time.
One bite at a time.
John, or thank you for those closing words.
Yeah.
We are gonna shut down. We'll see you guys. Yeah, we'll see you next week on the 10th. Yep, we'll be here. All right,
Thank
have a
you.
good week, guys. Thank you
You
for
bet.
all your
Thank
participation.
you,
Thanks,
Mike.
Mike.
Thank you.
Jesus is
Mike.
Lord, to the glory of God.
Yeah,
Bye now.
bye.
Bye.